Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Caroline Still, and I'm a project leader in Aurora's advisory team. And today I have the privilege of being joined by Tom Glover, RWE's UK country chair and the chair of RWE UK Renewables Boards. Tom is the most senior representative of RWE in the UK, responsible for representing the company at a national level, UK, Wales, and Scotland, and managing senior stakeholder engagement. Tom is also the chair of Carbon Capture and Storage Association and a trustee for a number of charities. He's worked for RWE since 2003. Tom, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be back on an Aurora podcast.
Today, we're going to be discussing GB energy landscape over the next 5 to 10 years, but specifically focusing on power. The future of GB energy is undoubtedly centered around large, robust, and decarbonized power sector. The last 10 years have seen rapid change in GB's electricity supply, but achieving full power decarbonization while also continuing to scale up supply remains a tall order. So let's discuss the main challenges the power sector is currently facing in a bit more detail and getting RWE's and Tom's take on the matter. The government's targets remain ambitious, aiming for over 110 gigawatts of renewables by 2030, more than doubling currently installed capacity in less than 5 years. Are these bold CP 2030 targets providing confidence to the market and to investors, Tom?
Well, look, I think we have to look at it, and the Clean Power 2030 is a great North Star. So it's a great ambition, and it makes people focus, and that clear ambition provides investors with confidence that overall the market will grow. So as a kind of target, it's great, but investors also look at the ability to invest. So what does that actually mean in terms of delivery? And we are facing a number of headwinds at the moment in our market. We've got the global headwinds that we can't affect just in the UK. So we've got higher costs of capital, higher supply chain costs. And actually, we've got a lot of pressure from our investors wanting us to return money because they aren't seeing high enough returns in the renewable space. So the global challenges. We've also got some UK specific challenges. So whilst the Clean Power Plan is a great kind of overall target, one of the problems is we're growing generation really fast and we're not growing demand at the same time. So that worries investors that effectively we might see a price collapse. We're also seeing material changes in policy. So, for example, the REMA legislation, and investors don't like uncertainty of policy. And finally, when we get to delivery, connections, although we're sorting it out with the queue reform, they remain quite an issue. So we've still got a lot lead time to connections, and connections are often delayed. So I would say it's great to have that target. That's absolutely brilliant. But we need to kind of address as many of the headwinds as we can in order that investors really, continue to deploy capital in this area.
That's really interesting the way you've broken it down there. And I think demand policy would build out to some of the key topics I want to discuss today. So that's a great opening. Let's start with the sort of renewable ambition, specifically the scale of it, to sort of discuss supply chain a bit more. Let's imagine AR7 is a huge success. So let's ignore the logistics that would need for that to clear with a huge amount of capacity. Let's just imagine it's a huge success, procuring enough capacity to make the clean power targets realistically achievable. So for context, AR7, 8, and 9 would each need to procure 15 to 20 gigawatts of renewables in order to sort of meet the CP 2030 targets. So when I say a huge success, we're looking at about 15 to 20 gigawatts of renewables procured in the upcoming round. What would be your first concern about successfully delivering on such a large procurement round for AR7?
So I think the first thing I would say, I'm not imagining it's going to be a success. It needs to be a success. So going back to your previous question, investors need to see delivery against the targets. So I think AR7 is the first big litmus test of the government's targets. Are they going to get delivered? So it needs to be success. What are my concerns around it? I think there's a number. I think we've talked already about some policy uncertainty. That policy uncertainty and the supply chain costs, those headwinds I talked about. One concern is that's going to lead to increased prices. Yeah. So I think one thing we're hoping is that the government decides to increase the tenor. We believe increasing the tenor of CFD will reduce the cost of capital, will reduce that policy uncertainty, make it even more attractive to invest in the UK. So hopefully drive down prices. So that's maybe one. I mean, I don't know, reverting a bit to what I answered before, a number of our connection dates for the projects are dependent on larger transmission or distribution connection projects upstream. So one of my concerns is, will they get delivered? From a supply chain perspective, the TO and DNO is delivering them, but actually just getting them through planning. So that's a big issue. And then finally, that's a significant increase in procurement for the supply chains. Now, we believe from the well-developed projects, those supply chains are very well prepared to deliver against that. But one of our worries is if we buy lots and lots of volumes and it includes not so well-developed projects, and those get basically contracts ahead of those with developed supply chains, we could get a supply chain reset, which could then lead to delays. So I think those would be our summary. So it's kind of policy, prices, supply chain connections would be our big concerns.
Yeah, that's really interesting, particularly about the tenor, because I think we've heard that echoed across the markets. Several stakeholders feel sort of 15 to 20 years would definitely help alleviate some of that pressure from government.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look internationally at the moment, the CFD regime is kind of the gold standard, but actually the tenor in lots of regimes is now longer. So when we're trying to compete on capital from other areas, it really helps to get that tenor longer.
Absolutely. And if we're looking at achieving a high penetration of renewables, I think one of the key things we need to discuss is transmission build out. And this is becoming even more topical given what happened in Spain and Portugal recently. And so I want to talk a little bit about the role of transmission build out and it being absolutely critical for achieving decarbonisation in GB. Aurora's modelling has proved this to be the case for a range of alternative net zero scenarios. So regardless of how you make up your net zero system, the transmission is a central piece of that. How serious is the threat of public perception and acceptance? Is the anti-pylon sentiment a major hurdle?
Yes, I would actually expand it. It's not only, we fully agree, we need transmission and a lot of transmission build to make this successful, but we also need a lot of distribution build. Yeah, so let's make sure, so it's all wires and all connections. And yeah, the anti-pylon sentiment is extremely serious when we look at how many projects are delayed because of connections. But actually, it's not just anti-pylon, isn't it? It's anti-solar, it's anti-wind. Almost any big infrastructure project gets objections now from extremely well-organized groups. Yep. So the whole net zero journey is subject to this. So I suppose on one hand, we really welcome what the government's been doing to address the deployment of major infrastructure. So the streamlining of planning, resourcing of planning authorities, showing benefits for local communities, etc. But I suppose we have a lot of real world experience of developing projects. And actually, we don't really see money off bills being the real driver against objections, because actually people who have their properties infringed by this infrastructure, a few £100 off their bill isn't going to change their minds. So really, we need to get the hearts and minds of people. And the government's working on this, and the transmission companies, but really it's all around. There's a lot of work we need to do as an industry, as governments, as policymakers, to kind of get the vision from the communities about this is a great, clean, low cost, high economic growth world, this green world. So yeah, it's a big issue, and there's a lot of work to do before we can be comfortable, that we're gonna get there.
I'd like to switch gear to gas a little bit, which is a sort of key proponent, I would say, for energy security. What is RWE's view on the changing role of gas power generation in GB? The move away from baseload generation is clear, but how can policymakers ensure that it remains an attractive investment when run hours are squeezed in a renewables-heavy grid?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And obviously, one we think about a lot because RWE is the largest gas generator in the UK. I mean, it's been clear for a long time, hasn't it? Like you say, the running hours are going to go down. So this is not new news. I think what's very interesting is if you look at almost every report, the amount of gas capacity required on the system remains roughly the same. I say it has been for the last 10 years. So we're looking at like 30 to 40 gigawatts, depending on what your scenario is. So our focus at RWE, I would say, is like twofold. One is, what's the strategy for each of our assets in our portfolio? Is it decarbonize? Is it life extension? Or ultimately, is it run to close? Yeah, that's kind of like our strategy. And then once we've worked out the strategy, our real focus is how can we reliably and efficiently run those power stations for the very low hours when they're needed? And effectively, the way we describe it internally is we expect ourselves to be like the fire brigade of the electricity sector. So we'll be infrequently used, but when we need, we best turn up, right? You don't have a fire brigade that doesn't turn up when there's a fire, right? So I think it's all about that, and it is extremely complicated, and each asset is different, and what the right solution for each asset is different. But I think we're always thinking about it, and when we look globally on this issue, what is good is the UK, from a policy perspective, has probably the gold standard with its capacity market. So there is a very clear, proven instrument that is keeping the capacity on today and encouraging new capacity. So that's great. We think it needs to evolve. So you need to evolve that to low carbon, to low factors, to probably different durations, different services within that firm capacity. But we see it more than like an evolution of the capacity market rather than a revolution. And then, you can see people are building new assets into that capacity market. So it's clearly attractive for investors.
Yeah, absolutely. Just taking a look at different ways of procuring a firm capacity to ensure energy security. The capacity market in GB has proven to be very successful in preventing scarcity events. I'd like to sort of talk about the sort of importance of things like the capacity market. It's a sort of top-down strategic planning. As the system pushes to decarbonize at an increasingly rapid pace, the balance between market-driven change and strategic planning starts to shift, something we've seen a lot of in the zonal pricing debate, for example. Who do you think the architect of the future system should be?
Yeah, well, I was hoping to do a podcast without mentioning zonal pricing, because it seems to be something that I've been quite vocal on for the last few years. But more seriously, I think RWE has long called for a strategic approach, right? So I think that's really important. However, we need to be really careful we don't rely too much on central planning. So I think we would differentiate between a strategy framework and actually very detailed central planning. And we do worry today, we see various initiatives that are very deterministic. So if you look at like the Clean Power Action Plan, it talks about not only the megawatts required, the technology and the location, right? And we're not, in our view, we're not allowing the market to decide. So whereas it's clear for us that the NESO is clearly responsible for strategic approach, I don't like the terminology used of a system architect, because if you deal with architects, they're right in the detail, right? Whereas I think what we want is a kind of a framework of tramlines where basically policymakers and the NESO set what they need at a kind of a very wide level, and allows them to step back and allow the market to determine what is the right technologies in the right locations to deliver those outcomes.
Yeah, I think the commentary on the word architect is very true in that sense, and finding that balance between providing a sort of skeletal framework that the market can operate in at the pace that we need it to operate in is proving to be quite challenging in a number of areas, not just zonal, but that was obviously the low-hanging fruit example that was available. Building on from that, what decisions do you think should be settled by strategic planning, and what decisions should be market-driven? Which areas are best suited for each of those?
Yeah, so I think I said, like, we're big supporters of strategic planning, and we see them as being like say the tram lines for which the market should operate within. And so obviously the overall network evolution, the approximate mix of different technology attributes, so how much low carbon, how much firm, how much variable, ancillary service requirements, etc. But in our kind of view, those should be procured in a way that allows competition between technologies, locations, and projects to get competitive prices and make sure the market is determining the best way to do it. I think you also need some strategic planning for land use, for marine use, and also for nascent technologies. There are technologies that won't get going unless we have some upfront investment. So, you mentioned I chair the Carbon Capture Association. Of course, carbon capture at its current state needs that starting momentum. Maybe some other technologies. So we need that. So for us, if you actually think about the good policy instruments that we've got already, so you think about the CFD and you think about the capacity market, what is good about them is they're not procuring specific technologies in the most frame. Obviously, we have offshore specific auctions, but if you take, like, say, the onshore solar market, you're allowing a frame where the market can determine, is it best to have a solar farm in the south or an onshore wind farm in the north? What's the yield payoff? What's the location payoff? What's the technology payoff? And I think it's the same for the capacity market. We don't determine whether it should be a battery, a GT, an OCGT, or whatever else. So from our perspective, those very successful instruments are really good ideas where clearly we're setting a strategic frame. So under the capacity market, we're saying win this much capacity in these years, but then we're allowing the market to decide what can best do that. So I think that would be our view. Yeah, and as I said, we've got concerns where you're getting too much in the detail and being too prescriptive. So, saying you need X gigawatts of solar in a particular location without knowing how its economics compares really between X gigawatts of solar in a different location, we think that's quite a dangerous approach.
Yeah. So the decision to sort of allocate different gigawatts of renewables in different locations is too much of the strategic planning from RWE's perspective.
Yeah, because so from our perspective, no one has perfect
that's
knowledge.
Very true.
Right? This is a very uncertain future. So to think that one entity can determine, exactly which technology we need where, and also which grid level, without any permeability between grid levels, without swaps between technologies, without swaps between locations, seems extremely difficult. That we're either going to, it might be we get exactly the right answer. I think that's highly unlikely. It's more likely we get it wrong. Whereas this is the power of the market or the power of the crowd or whatever you want to call it, which is, the more people that do it, of course, individual investors will get it wrong. But overall, we should probably end up with a better economic outcome by allowing the market to compete against itself.
Are you concerned that technology agnostic approach might lack the pace that we need at this stage in the transition?
Not really. I mean, I think we need to start at the grid queue. I think actually there's potentially the opposite, which we haven't taken into account any attrition, or that for certain technologies will become uneconomic. So the problem is at the moment you've got this problem that as an investor, you might be looking at it in a region and you think there's enough batteries. So you think, well, I'm not going to develop any more batteries because I've been told centrally that they're no longer required. And then if the batteries ahead of them don't develop, it's going to have a delay when I come later to have to restart a project. So I think there's risks also in that very deterministic approach that haven't been necessarily fully thought through. But this is why also you do need the trend lines. This is where the balance is, because you certainly need strategic development of the grid to make sure that we're going way further in advance than we have done previously. So it's a little bit of both, isn't it? And it's to me, it's like some kind of sweet spot. Is we all agreed there wasn't enough strategic planning, so we've asked for more strategic planning, and now we've gone, I think, maybe a little bit far the other way towards central planning, and we need to just maybe pause and go, well, is that what we really wanted, or do we want to, allow the market to decide a little bit more?
Yeah, the pendulum sort of swings.
Maybe, yeah.
We focused quite a bit on the supply of power, but I'd like to sort of go back to one of the key things that you brought up in the beginning of the conversation, which was around demand. We're decarbonizing the supply of power at a rapid pace, and that's going relatively successfully. But in order to recover the growing costs of this transformation, we will need significantly more users. And so shifting the conversation to the challenges of electrification becomes quite critical at this point in GB's journey. What demand areas are you bullish on for electrification?
Yeah, good question. And this comes back to there's not one view, right? I think it's very uncertain, right? We've got very large macro trends at the moment. So underlying economic growth is quite uncertain. The migration of energy intensive users is quite uncertain, and also various decarbonisation pathways plus efficiency. So I think where we see it, if I'm going to summarize it, is in principle we see road transportation and the residential mainly going down the electrification route.
Yeah.
Right. So I think those are quite certain. I think you've got a massive amount of uncertainty on data center demand growth. So we all read the stories about this exponential growth. I wonder how much of it's a bubble and how much is real.
Yeah.
So I think that's really uncertain. And if you look at the forecasts, they're extremely wide about what could happen on data center demand. So I think that's a real uncertainty. And then the industry bit is really difficult because it relies on a macro view on how much we're supporting industries. So I think there's a whole load of questions around industry migration. So how much actually stays within the UK? But then there's the thing about what's the best way to go. Is it electrification? Is it hydrogen? Is it CCS? It's very unclear. So I think the industrial growth scenarios are quite unclear. So Yeah. And I think the other thing to mention from our view is the growth to 2030. We're not actually seeing that much. I don't think many people do see that much. Certainly, the NESO work doesn't see a huge increase in demand by 2030, and
Mm.
we would kind of agree with that. So all this huge demand growth is coming in the 2030s and 2040s, which in itself means it's very uncertain. Yeah, because we're forecasting in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time. So we would say it's uncertain. We fully believe road transportation will go to EVs. We fully believe in heat pumps. I think the rest of it is a lot more uncertain.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially on heat pumps, the sort of cost of installing something like that, and this you're looking at not being able to centrally execute that as easily as you can, the transmission system, for example, it does add additional complexity.
But I think that's where we might come on to that. This is where we need to make sure that the ratio between gas and electricity prices is set at better than the heat pump efficiency. And then people will automatically find heat pumps cheaper. So the moment the problem is your electricity price is 4 to 5 times gas, and your efficiency of your heat pump might be 3 times. So if we can get that differential down to below 3, say 2.5 and 3, then it will just make economic sense to put a heat pump in. And for somebody who's got a heat pump, I love my heat pump. So it actually as a heating solution, it's really good technology. So we just need to get the ratio between gas and power prices right, and then I think people will convert as it becomes a much more standard technology. And obviously, there's leaps and bounds going in the standardization of all the technology and the training of engineers to install it. So, I think that's an area we should be able to get very comfortable. At least the installation costs will come down significantly.
That's really interesting. The sort of decoupling of the gas price and the electricity price, in the sense that right now it's, the electricity price is obviously very much set by the gas price. And once we get to a very high renewable system, there will be a decoupling there, which is sort of where we need to get to start protecting household and industrial bills, which leads me on
Yeah.
to the next question, actually. GB household and industrial bills are shouldering a very large burden of the transition at the moment. What's the risk here you see for the economy and for eventually achieving decarbonization if these users are not better shielded?
Yeah, so I think we all recognize that high electricity prices are a barrier to economic growth and to electrification, as we just talked about before. And it also poses a major challenge to the ongoing viability of lots of businesses, particularly those competing on a national and international stage. And we also know too many households are struggling to pay their
Yeah.
bills. And so, ultimately, renewables and clean power is the solution to this. We're going to, as you said, we decouple from gas. We end up with low marginal cost system. We can increase demand, and so the pound per megawatt hour should go down. So we know that's the end point, but it's quite a journey to get there. And at the moment, there's lots of policy costs and taxes on energy bills, but they're particularly on the electricity side. And so we are not taxing the polluter. The polluter is the gas boilers, is the gas fired. The polluter is not the people electrifying. So, I think like Energy UK, like Committee on Climate Change, we generally support that we're shifting those policy costs and taxes more onto the gas bill or onto general taxation, which obviously at the moment it would be deeply unattractive for the Treasury, but that's probably where it needs to go. That then, as I said, would allow electricity prices to get to a sensible ratio to gas prices, which will automatically lead people to electrification. And to emphasize the point you made earlier, like the problem we've got at the moment is we're accelerating on the generation side. So we're putting hundreds of billions into that side, but we're not increasing demand. So we're in the kind of pound per megawatt hour equation. You're increasing the pounds, but you're not increasing the pound per the megawatt hour.
Yeah.
You need to increase the megawatt hour in order to get the pounds per megawatt hour down to a sensible level. So, we really want to see increasing electrification, and also the flexibility that it provides, the flexibility that demand will provide will also lead to a more robust system.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, hopefully there's complexity in the way that would be managed, but I completely agree. I'd finally like to sort of address the macro environment, which you've alluded to a bit during this conversation, because it's obviously unavoidable in today's world. Growth has slowed, the cost of borrowing is up, supply chain costs are quite volatile, and investors, quite importantly, are starting to question net zero objectives. all in all, there's massive headwinds on the global stage for the transition. What can and should the UK specifically be doing to take advantage of that uncertainty and remain attractive to global investors on the world stage?
Yeah, so you're certainly right. There are massive headwinds at the moment. You just need to Google RWE and our investors, and you see the kind of pressures that we're under.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also an opportunity for the UK. And there's a great saying, isn't there? You don't need to run faster than the bear. You just need to run faster than other people. And I kind of put it like that. So we can't solve the global headwinds, but we can address the UK headwinds. So our job is to make the UK run faster than the other countries, right? That's it, in very simple terms. So we want to make out of all the countries that say RWE looks at, in my job as UK country chair, is to try and get the capital towards the UK. So I want the UK framework to be more attractive than any other market. So in my view, what policymakers need to do is sort the stuff they can sort. So we can't sort the global headwinds, but they can make the UK the best place to invest. And we've got a great starting point. We started at the beginning talking about, the great North Star that is Clean Power Plan 2030, the CFD regime, the capacity market. These are really investable instruments that currently make the UK, for example, one of RWE's best markets. But we need to, at the moment, we need this razor-sharp focus of stop inflicting our own issues, right? And what I mean by that is, we've got the REMA process, right? That is policy uncertainty. Investors hate it. You want to get that resolved, but whatever the conclusion is, we need to get that to close with clear decisions and a clear framework that investors can go against. We need to make sure we deliver the transmission. So we need to make sure that the UK remains a great place to invest. So if we do that and we have a successful AR7, so we actually prove that our delivery matches our targets. So we close REMA, we deliver AR7, and actually I think then the UK will remain one of the best places to invest. And hopefully, relative to others, we can attract the investment.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Thanks, Tom. And I think the word remain there is important because in the last 10 years, the UK has been a very attractive place to invest. So it's really just keeping on that. I'd love to keep talking about all of these key issues, but unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Tom, thank you very much for joining me today on Aurora's podcast. It's been a pleasure having you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
That was Caroline Still, project leader in Aurora's advisory team, talking to Tom Glover, RWE's UK country chair and the chair of RWE UK Renewables Boards. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow the podcast via whatever platform you use.